A lot is going on in the world. We'll be talking about that at the beginning of the show. And then I've got a very esteemed guest that'll be joining us as well. So looking forward to this conversation. And of course, we do know that Hollywood is in the news because of the Screen Actors Guild strike that is still going on. I understand the writers have settled and all along those lines, but maybe Mr. Barber will have some thoughts around that, in addition to some other things that he's been involved in, including the creation of an entire industry and all along those lines that is part of the television landscape as far as I'm concerned right now, and all in that space. But before we get to that, let's get to some of the things that are happening in the world. Israel is saying that they plan to maintain its security in Gaza indefinitely, according to Netanyahu. And that is something that we are seeing in the news. So, a month into the war, their leader is saying that Israel will have an overall security role, I should say, in Gaza. So that is something that is going on and is definitely continuing to stay in the news and all along those lines. So that is something that is going on. And apparently Israel's unintentional nuclear admission is raising some concerns as well. And that is definitely something that even the Russian folks are saying as well. So it'll be interesting to see what folks say about that notion as well. And Israel forces have arrested a Palestinian activist ahead Tamimi at her home, and definitely she was arrested on suspicion of inciting violence. So that is something else that is going on, and that was actually in the West Bank area and all in that space. So definitely that is something that we are seeing in the news, and apparently Netanyahu is facing rising anger from within Israel after the Hamas attack. So definitely that is something going on. And I do remember that there had even been conversation about how much they were aware of things from a security standpoint. And Israeli military says that it hit a Hezbollah position in Lebanon. So that particular war could be expanding as well. So that is something else that we are seeing in the news. And of course, folks are still paying attention to what is going on in Russia and Ukraine as well. So that is something else that I was seeing in the news. Zelensky says it's not the right time for elections in Ukraine. So he is ruling out that possibility. And apparently the Wagner Group is training Chechen special forces. So that is something else that is going on in that part of the world as that conflict continues to rage on as well. And NATO has announced the formal suspension of the Cold War era security treaty after Russia's pullout. So Russia formally pulled out of the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, and definitely that is something that has been in the news and even been a point of contention in some of the presidential elections in the past as well. But it does look like that has now been disbanded. And Olaf Scholz is hailing Germany's historic clampdown on illegal immigration. So immigration isn't just something that impacts the United States, it impacts a number of other countries as well. So Germany is to impose stricter rules to curb their migration influx. And Chancellor Olaf Scholz and state governors agree on new measures to curb migration there in Germany. And over speaking of folks that are migrating from places or actually fleeing places, the Rafah border crossing has reopened in Gaza for certain foreign nationals. So 80 Canadians are eligible to leave Gaza, but apparently hundreds are remaining in that area as well. So definitely a lot is going on in that space. And of course, a lot of people are concerned about the deaths that are going on there of both children, women, and a number of others as well. So that's going on, but not just there, but apparently Yemen is going on, and Yemen Houthis are claiming a new drone attack on Israel, but no assault has been detected. So that is an Iran-backed attack. So Yemen's rebels are claiming revenge and all in that space. So like I said, there's a lot of hotspots around the world, but in another kind of things that are going on, because we knew those sometimes political leaders face issues as well. The Portuguese Prime Minister Antonio Costas is engulfed in a corporation crisis, or a corruption crisis, I should say. A corruption crisis, as definitely the Portuguese Prime Minister is to address the lithium probe, as the minister is named a suspect in a graft case. So that is something that we're seeing in the news. And in Poland, another one of those P countries, Poland's president has tapped Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki to form a new government. So that's just something going on as well. So it looks like there was the Polish president tapped the outgoing prime minister to form the government despite having the lack of a majority. And coming back to Ukraine, Ukraine is ordering an investigation after a Russian attack on a brigade ceremony. So that is something else that we are seeing as well. And definitely there are a number of other things that are going on in the world as well. I might get to one that involved the UK, and that was actually a speech that was given by the current king and all along those lines. So let's see what they have to say about that, and then we'll get to some U.S. Situations, and then I'll get to my special guest, and we'll be talking about something that's a little bit on the lighter side and all in that space, but still something very interesting as well. So Charles gave the first King's speech in 72 years amid parliamentary pomp and circumstance and all in that way. And in that speech, he announced the watering down of net zero. So that is something else that is going on. So he is looking at things and probably around the climate change issue and all in that space. And apparently, the Trump attorney has says, coming back to the U.S., that the New York Attorney General is just not that bright. And apparently, there are some folks that are saying that Trump lost his temper on the witness stand during the trial as well. So definitely, that is going on as folks are dealing with that particular part of the world as well. And the Nashville mayor has ordered an investigation after there were purported leaks of the Christian school shooters manifesto. So Nashville shooter Audrey Hale's alleged writing in service. And apparently he said in that, I want to kill all you little crackers and all in that space. But definitely the Nashville mayor is ordering an investigation after those writings were posted online. And of course, we do know that today is election day. If you haven't done early voting, you can get out in a lot of places, including right here in North Carolina, and get out and do your civic duty of voting. And apparently, abortion rights is one of the things that will be at stake in terms of one of the issues that will be going on in Ohio, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Virginia. I know right here in Durham, North Carolina, we're looking for a race between a senator, that being Mike Woodard, and all along those lines. And in addition to that kind of race, he'll be going up against Leonardo Williams, who is actually the business executive that is seen as the front runner and all in that kind of way. So definitely that is something that is going on here. And the Supreme Court is going to hear a major gun case on the rights of accused domestic abusers to possess guns and all in that space. So that is something else that is coming before the Supreme Court and all along those lines. So it looks like there's also going to be a third debate. Speaking of debates, and one of the things that Mr. Barber did is he wrote about a great president, and we'll definitely be getting to that very shortly as well. But Republican presidential hopefuls are gathering for their third debate, and 5 Republicans have qualified for that debate and all in that space. And once again, Trump will not be participating and all in that kind of situation. But it'll be interesting to see what goes on in this space. And the special counsel in Hunter Biden probe is to meet with House Republicans. So House Judiciary investigators are to question special counsel David Weiss on the Hunter Biden probe. But that's just some of the things that are going on in addition to warmer weather. That's right. It's definitely warmer weather right here in Durham, North Carolina, and all in that space. But like I said, I have a very special guest. So I'm getting ready to bring him on, and we're going to talk about a number of things and all along those lines. So John Barber, glad to have you here. It sounds to me that in doing my research and all along those lines, that you are actually one of the fathers of what some people call reality TV. And definitely, I know that some people are big fans of things like Survivor and Amazing Race, and there's a number of other kinds of reality TV that is out there as well. But I know that you used to be the person that created a show called Real News over there in California and all in that space. And you had the pleasure of interviewing some amazing individuals, including some controversial individuals like Jane Fonda on one side and Ronald Reagan on the other. So I just wondering if you can share a little bit about your own journey and all in that space.
Well, Mark, I'm absolutely delighted to be with you, but I should start off this conversation by quoting Mark Twain, my second favorite writer. 100 years ago, during one of America's first great fake wars against the Philippines, he said, if you don't read American newspapers, you are uninformed. And if you do read American newspapers, you are misinformed. And we are continuing to be misinformed because in this country, they keep referring to what is happening in Israel as a war. It is not a war. It is target practice. Do you remember a comedian named Bill Hicks?
The name sounds familiar.
Bill Hicks was by far the most brilliant comedian in this country. He was better than Steve Martin. He was better than Lenny Bruce. He was better than George Carlin. He was the only one smart enough and brave enough to write great jokes about the assassination of John Kennedy, which is in my second documentary. And during Bush's fake war on Iraq, where there were no weapons of mass destruction, and it was proven, and Bush kept calling it a war, Bill Hicks said, hey, isn't it a war when both sides are equally armed? And of course, Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, okay? And what it is that's happening in Israel is that the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians what the Nazis did to them in Warsaw. And the reason that this country and the leaders in this country, who are white Europeans who own this country, are not saying much about what slaughter Netanyahu is doing, because these people realize that Netanyahu is looking on the Palestinians the way our founding fathers looked on the Indians, where it was that Mark Twain said, when these people, these Europeans, came to America and wanted another acre of land, they would just shoot an Indian, and it would only cost a nickel for a bullet, and they would whine about the cost of the bullet. And I hate to say all that, Mark, because in 1972, do you remember the Munich massacre?
I do remember that.
Yes, the 12 Israeli athletes were slaughtered by Black Tuesday, Palestinian terrorist group. And I went on television and I talked about what it must be like to be a Jew in the world today. That piece was picked up by the United Jewish Appeal. And that 4-minute film was used for 2 years to raise $35 million. And I was so honored. I got a call from Neil Simon, who was being honored by the state of Israel. And because of that, he wanted me to come down and host that. And Israel planted a tree in my honor in Israel. I'm not so sure I would do that again today because of what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. You know, I often thought, you know, the horrors that the Germans perpetrated on the Jews should have resulted in the Jews getting half of Germany and not half of Palestine, where they really didn't belong. So anyway, but I don't like to talk politics because politics in America is as dead as John Kennedy.
Well, speaking of that and everything, you wrote those two great novels and films and all along those lines. And I know that one of the things that you have talked about in those films is JFK, and we'll be celebrating the 60th anniversary of his death coming up on November 22nd. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the notion of what led you to that movies or two movies. And I know one of those movies was actually honored by one of the premier figures in terms of being known for their JFK movie, but even Oliver Stone, the great director, talked about your first movie and how he thought it was a great companion piece and all along those lines.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And Mark, like every absolute wonderful thing that has happened to me during my life has happened quite by accident. And I'm, you know, a well-known agnostic, but in my book, which is called Your Mother's Not a Virgin, which is by far the best book ever written about anybody in show business, I point out quite honestly that there's been a lot of what I call divine intervention in my life. I mean, I was born in the Salvation Army Charity Ward in Toronto, came from a very dysfunctional family before it was popular. And my father and mother fought so bitterly that my father thought in 1939 he'd be better off taking a gun and going and fighting the Germans, which he did. He lost his stomach, got the order of the British Empire, and never came home. And my mother, to replace him, brought uncles like they were grapes into my home to bed with her and to booze with her and beat her. And I was out on the street when I was 6 years of age, and I only survived by going to the theater, to the movie theater, where I could see a double feature for 5 cents. As a Canadian, I spent a lot of time almost choking up thinking about it. Spending time in a hockey rink. I spent half my time in a jail, and right across the street from the jail was a library where, again, I spent most of my time. I came to the United States illegally to be a gambler. I was deported twice. At 46, I was unemployable. And in 1977, I got my citizenship papers from Senator John Tunney of California. And then in 1979, as you mentioned, I accidentally got Real People on the Air. It was the absolute first and the best reality show in the history of American television. And Gary Deeb, who was the television critic of the Chicago Tribune, who had the best line ever about television, Gary said, "Television is the only business in America where competition does not improve the product." But he dubbed me the godfather of reality television, and that's what happened. Now, I've spent 53 years from 1970 trying to tell Mr. Garrison's story. He solved the murder of John Kennedy. And in 1967, when he arrested Clay Shaw, you see him on camera saying, "We have witnesses, we have money exchanged, we have the shooters, and there are going to be convictions in court." Now, I'm just this guy down from Canada who is so anxious to become an American citizen. I believe what the government is telling me, which is that Mr. Garrison's a kook and he's a nut, he's an egomaniac. But as a street kid, Mark, I kept saying, hey, if Mr. Garrison does have nothing on Clay Shaw, why doesn't he get out of his way and let him fall on his ass? But for 2 years, they sabotaged him. They have sent 8 CIA agents to try to destroy his case, which sadly they did. He only lost the conspiracy case, but he won the most important case, was the perjury case against Clay Shaw, because Clay Shaw, this prominent New Orleans businessman, but also for 10 years with the CIA. In those years, Mark, it was very difficult for Americans to know what the CIA was. But how smart Garrison was, he got his tax records for 10 years and showed for 10 years he's paid by the CIA. The jury didn't quite understand that. But he had 87 witnesses who saw Clay Shaw with David Ferry, Lee Harvey Oswald, Jack Ruby, all planning crossfire in Dallas. And when he won that case, the U.S. government stepped in and stopped it. Now, very sadly, it's strange that we're on today, but because of Oliver Stone's magnificent film, JFK, they passed the Records Assassination Act, and 3 years ago, all the files were to be released. And yet this past week, Joe Biden stepped back and said, I'm going to have nothing else to do with telling them to release the files. And so the CIA announced they are never releasing the files. So we will never, ever know that the CIA actually murdered the president. But if you watch my 3 definitive films, the first one is called The Garrison Tapes, won the Best Film Award, in Spain at San Sebastian. My second film is called The American Media and the Second Assassination of President John F. Kennedy, which will outlast Oliver Stone's film and all the books. This will be around 100 years from now. Now, my third documentary, which opens November 22nd at the Town Center Theater in Encino, is simply called John Barber's and William Shakespeare's Last Word on the Murder of JFK. And what it does, it tells parallel stories, Mark, of my 53 years of trying to sell Mr. Garrison's story, and then the years that I was trying to live a productive and successful life in television, which I did for years and years, and how to be a terrific father to my son because I didn't have a family life, and to be a terrific husband to my wife, because if it had not been for my wife, there would not have been any real people. So would you like me to start at how I accidentally first met Mr. Garrison?
Yeah, I definitely want to get to that. But before we get to that, one of the other things I was curious about, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, is there is a lot of people that are wondering about the power of Hollywood and the power of Hollywood, just like the power of the media. And I know that in reading some of your stuff, you've talked about how you have done all of this amazing work, but unfortunately, you have not had the rewards that a lot of people may think that you deserve, and all in that space. And like I said at the beginning, we do know that the writers had a settlement, but the Screen Actors Guild is still on strike and everything. So I'm just wondering what your perception is of the nature of Hollywood in the 21st century.
Well, right now, Hollywood is meaningless because they don't produce anything that's meaningful. The greatest year in Hollywood was 1939. Look at Gone with the Wind and Goodbye, Mr. Chips, just scores and scores of magnificent films. There are no more magnificent films made in Hollywood. And I hate to say that because my son is an important producer in Hollywood. He's one of the executive producers of Criminal Minds. And he's one of the lead writers of Criminal Minds. And fortunately for them, they have just settled the strike, and the actors have yet to settle the strike. And one of the things that is really disturbing is this artificial intelligence, where they can recreate you without your permission. They could do a show that would look like you and sound like you, and you have nothing to say about it. And that's what the strikes are all about. I mean, it's turning into George Orwell's Brave New World, and it's becoming horribly, horribly dehumanized. Yes, and America is never going to get better because America fell apart the day they murdered John Kennedy. Mm-hmm. It is a cold case at the Justice Department. And you don't see Oliver Stone or Dr. Cyril Wecht or any of these big mockers in the assassination community trying to go this November 22nd and, like the Bastille Day, storming the Justice Department and saying, open your doors and let's see the truth. We are never going to see the truth unless you watch my films. Otherwise, it's going to vanish. Mm-hmm. Everything that went wrong with America went wrong when they murdered John Kennedy. That is the Pandora's box that you have to open. Now, they had the House Select Committee was created because nobody had seen the Zapruder film since Dan Rather lied to us in 1963 and said that the third bullet hits him in the back of the head and he's thrown violently forward, which is a crock of crap. But we all believed Uncle Walter and we all believed Uncle Dan, but not until 1977 when Geraldo Rivera had Dick Gregory and Robert Gordon on his show to show the Zapruder film. And we see that the media and our government has lied to us since 1963 because clearly he was shot from the front and thrown violently backwards. So millions of people stormed Congress. They created the House Select Committee. Now the CIA appoints a hack named Robert Blake to cover up that investigation into the murder of John Kennedy, as the same way they had Earl Warren and Gerald Ford covering up the Warren Commission investigation into the murder of John Kennedy. That Warren Commission book should be in the fiction department at the library. And Blakey was so overt in his thanks to the Central Intelligence Agency that, first of all, he blames the mafia. The mafia were only hirelings. And if the mafia had actually murdered the president, there wouldn't be a pizza parlor open in America today. Okay? That's the truth. Okay? They were just hirelings. Look at Sam Giancana, chief mafioso of Chicago, and Sinatra's best friend, by the way. And for 4.5 years, I was Frank Sinatra's private writer, which we may not even get to. But a week before, Giancana is supposed to testify before the House Select Committee. He's cooking pasta in his basement with his best friend. His best friend goes behind him and shoots him in the back of the head. He falls to the ground. He puts 6 bullets around his mouth, which is the mafia's way to say, shut up. And then another witness who had already testified before the House Select Committee, his body is found hacked in pieces in a barrel in the Pacific Ocean. And not one word from the New York Times or the Washington Post or Time Magazine or anything, because there was a thing called Operation Paperclip. And Operation Paperclip was created shortly after 1947, when Harry Truman created the CIA and this horrible security state in which we find ourselves living now. And then they created something called Project Mockingbird, because Russia was no enemy to the United States after the Second World War. As Jim Garrison clearly points out, they lost, mark, 25 million people and 80% of all their infrastructure. And you may remember that when John Kennedy took office, the president at the time, Dwight D. Eisenhower, the beloved Ike, went on camera and warned America about the military-industrial complex that was taking over the country. Do you remember that?
I do remember hearing that. And one of the things I was curious about, and it actually brings up one of the other people that you interviewed, and all along those lines, because I know that one of the people that actually went against the government in a certain way was Muhammad Ali. And I know that there has been conversations around COINTELPRO and a number of other things. I was wondering if you could talk about that and whether you think that that is a real thing that was going on even within the civil rights struggle, because I do know that there have been people that have said that there was targeted attempts to go after civil rights leaders, whether that was Martin Luther King, whether that was Malcolm X, whether that was a number of others as well. And the term I've always heard is COINTELPRO.
Well, the leading target for the FBI and the CIA, aside from John Kennedy, because there was a failed attempt in Chicago, there was a failed attempt in Miami, but they were very successful in Dallas. And it's all proven and outlined in these 3 documentaries. But it was J. Edgar Hoover who said that Martin Luther King was the greatest threat to the United States of America. And his code name for him was codename Zero. And he had notified, and they used to, it is no secret that John Kennedy had affairs. No secret that Jim Garrison, my idol, had affairs. And it was no secret that Martin Luther King had affairs. And the FBI sent these recordings to Martin Luther King of him having affairs and suggested he commit suicide. actually suggested he commit suicide, but of course he did not. Okay. And he organized that I have a speech. I have a dream speech in Washington, D.C. And you know that was a written speech. And that phrase, I have a dream, was never in his written speech. The written speech is owned by a very successful basketball player. But during this speech, he had to wait so long for the applause of Mahalia Jackson, who was a very dear friend of mine and my wife's, said to him, "Hey, Martin, why don't you tell the people what you tell us in private, that you have a dream?" So he proceeded to say that. It became one of the most famous speeches. It's as famous as Gettysburg speech or Lincoln's speech at Gettysburg, one of the greatest in history. But they murdered him. And it's in a book called Killing the King. And it was written by Sirhan's lawyer, who was named Pepper, William Pepper. And what no American seems to know, that Coretta King, the widow of Martin Luther King, sued the government of the United States for complicity in the murder of her husband and won the case. There was not one white newsman in that courtroom to hear that verdict. There was not one black newsman there to hear that verdict. The only one there to hear that verdict was Dick Gregory. Now, Coretta could have won millions of dollars with this lawsuit. And you know how much she asked for?
How much?
$1,000, because that's all it costs to bury her husband. She didn't want any of the government's dirty money. So he was shot at the Lorraine Motel with the assistance of some blacks because he was first in the ground floor. And a couple of the blacks, the ones wearing ties who were working with the CIA, one of them very well known, got him to move upstairs where he would become a target and he could be shot. He was shot in the chin. A shot to the chin did not murder Martin Luther King, because when he was taken to the hospital, William Pepper found out that there were about 18 blue suits from Secret Service and the CIA storming the hospital, and found a nurse's aide that saw Dr. King smothered on a bed by 3 agents. And nobody knows about this stuff. You know what has happened? I hate to say it because I've had a magnificent career in this country. Oh my God, have I ever. And I love this country more than ever. But this country has become what Ronald Reagan once called the Soviet Union, the evil empire. And that is indeed what it is we are. Now, if you want to know about Muhammad Ali.
Yes.
Muhammad Ali, I was only one of 3 people who would put him on television. The other 2 people were Jack Paar, by far the greatest late night talk show host in American history. And the other was Howard Cosell, the sportscaster. And I had him on for an hour and a half. And I wrote the next day did the Flip Wilson show. And he asked me to write my introduction for him for the Flip Wilson show. And one of the questions I asked him, and this was a time, this is how hypocritical all Americans are. And I can give you proof of it with my first conversation with Jim Garrison. Most Americans, 99% of all Americans, are cowards before the fact, and they're heroes after the fact. Because when Muhammad Ali was on my show, you couldn't find 5 Americans except a few blacks and Jane Fonda who thought he was a hero. They wanted him in a grave, or they wanted him in prison for opposing a war in Vietnam. And he said, hey, I'm not going over there to fight and kill any yellow people when it's white people that are my problem in this country. They hated that man. And at one point in the conversation, I asked him, Muhammad, when you were Cassius Clay before you changed your name, I said, what were your heroes as a kid? Now, you could never guess, Mark, who he said his greatest hero is. If you were Muhammad Ali and I asked you, what would you say? Or who would you say would be your greatest hero?
I mean, and personally, my greatest heroes have been my own parents and some of my grandparents and some other people that have been in my life. But I can only guess who Muhammad Ali's would have been, and that would be probably way off base.
Oh my God, what a wonderful, sweet thing for you to say. You know, and people ask me, even though I had the worst parents in the world, I said they were the greatest examples I ever saw. They said, my God, John, they were boozers, they were brawlers. They threw their son out of the house. How could they be an example? And I said, because they are two of the kind of human beings that I do not want to grow up to be like. And I never did. So I think that's wonderful. You had that great upbringing. Now, I thought when I asked who his heroes were, I thought he might say Sugar Ray Robinson or Joe Louis or Jackie Robinson. I thought it would be an athlete of some sort. Or Douglas, who was one of the great intellectuals in America, a black man, or Paul Robeson, America's greatest performing artist and political activist, murdered also by the FBI. I thought he was going to say somebody like that. You know who he said was his hero?
Who's that?
Gorgeous George. Do you remember Gorgeous George?
You remember wow.
Well, tell the people who he
Well, I'm trying to remember. I know that he was definitely, I want to say he was involved in athletics as well, but I'm trying to remember exactly who he was.
He was sort of like the Alex Jones of wrestlers.
Right.
Yes, and he would dress like the Pope and dress like Liberace and get up there and call every other wrestler an absolute and total jerk, and he was going to destroy them. He would call the audience jerks. And I said to Muhammad, I said, how on earth could he be your idol? And he said, because he filled every auditorium with people who wanted to see him beat up. And he said, so I am that way because I know that people will come to see me get beat up, but they won't know that I'm going to fly like a butterfly and sting like a bee. He was so absolutely wonderful. And it is a shame we were never to save that interview. But now, after all of these years, and then when he's incapable of speaking any longer, now he's an idol.
Yeah. Speaking of idols and everything, I want to talk about an idol, not get to Trump, we might get to him later, but there was another idol of the right, and it's still an idol of the right, and you had the pleasure of interviewing him as well, and he actually came out of the acting community, and some people think that that was the beginning of actors becoming politicians. But what was it like interviewing Ronald Reagan? Because I also know you had the pleasure of interviewing Ronald Reagan, and a lot of people saw him as a icon because he was definitely a B-movie star, but he also became a political leader. So what was that interview like, and how did that come about?
Oh, what a great question. Can you see behind me on the wall? There's a picture of me sitting down and Ronald Reagan standing up.
Wow.
That was that. Okay. I was the first host of AM Los Angeles, and it became the most successful morning show in the history of American television. And I was lucky enough to do it and interview, as you said, people like Cesar Chavez, Muhammad Ali, and Jane Fonda. Well, Reagan was running for a second term as governor, and he wanted to go on my show because it's in California rather than the Today Show. That's how successful my show was. So I always wanted to interview him for only one reason, because Ronald Reagan was running around California saying, you know, America is going to collapse. And one of the reasons they're going to collapse, all of the students up at Berkeley are growing long hair, and they're disrespecting their teachers. They're disrespecting their politicians the same way they did in the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire collapsed, and we are going to collapse the same way. Now, that was his rhetoric every single day. So I had the most brilliant question to ask him. And I couldn't wait to get him on the show, but we never invited him on the show. He called to come on the show. We were live. It's about 8 or 9 minutes before airtime. I'm sitting down. He's there with 4 or 5 of his blue suits. And his press director comes over to me and looks at my desk, and he sees nothing on my desk. He says, "Where's the sheet of paper with the questions?" I said, "I don't have any sheet of paper with the questions." He said, "Well, the governor wants to know what kind of questions you're going to ask." I said, "I haven't got the foggiest idea what kind of questions I'm going to ask. He's just going to sit down here and we're going to have a chat like we're in our front room, and it just happens to be on camera." He said, "Well, the governor won't come on, I assure you." Are you sure of that? And he said, "Yes, I am sure of that." So it goes back and he tells Governor Reagan, "I don't have any questions for him." So the governor looks at me and does that like, "Adios." And the guy comes back, and it's a good thing he came back and they didn't just walk out. He said, "Governor sends his regrets, but he is not coming on a show unless he knows what you're going to ask him." And I said, "Fine by me." And he was startled. I said, "Because this show is live." And after we talked to the governor, whether he's here or not, we open up the phones for an hour because there are thousands of people out there who want to talk to the governor or any guest. So if you guys go toodly-loo and you're gone, I will simply look at the camera and say, "Listen, this guy for the press secretary said I didn't have questions prepared, and the governor was upset that there were no set questions, so they left. So I do not have a guest for you folks, so I'm just going to open the phone and let's talk about Ronald Reagan." Well, he ran back to Ronald Reagan. I mean, ran back, whispered in his ear. Reagan rushes forward. I'm sitting down. He grabs my hand and he says, "John, I have no idea what I'm going to say. I have no idea what you're going to say, but this is going to be one of the most interesting conversations that I ever had." And indeed, he was brilliant because he was exactly like the greatest film actor ever, who was Cary Grant. If you saw Cary Grant as I did, I was a mail boy at Paramount, so I used to go and watch them filming Houseboat with Sophia Loren and other movies. If you watched him while he was on stage, he was the most boring actor you ever saw. But if you went to watch the dailies, as I did, I couldn't look at Sophia Loren. I couldn't take my eyes off of Cary Grant. The camera loved it. The same with Ronald Reagan. So now get this. After he's very, very comfortable, and boy, can that guy talk. And he's really comfortable. He's very likable. And I bring up this question to him about, "Well, you're going around up there in Berkeley saying that this country is going to collapse because the students are growing long hair. They're protesting the war in Vietnam. They're disregarding and disrespecting their leaders and teachers. Did it ever occur to you, Governor, that maybe the Roman Empire collapsed because the students there were pointing out that the Romans were fighting an illegal war in Palestine the way we're fighting one in Vietnam?" I thought I had him nailed. It's like he never heard the question. He just kept going and going and ignored it. Now, I'm a lot like Richard Burton. When I did a show, I never wanted to watch myself after I did the show. Burton never wanted to look at himself on screen. But I gathered the staff and we watched the interview with Ronald Reagan. And I said, "This guy is going to become the next president of the United States because the camera loves him. The same way the camera loved John Kennedy more than it loved Richard Nixon." And you know the first thing Ronald Reagan did when he became president? He destroyed the Fairness Doctrine. Because when I had Reagan on, now you might remember there was a thing called the Fairness Doctrine. When I had Reagan on, a Democrat, I then had to have a Republican. And then I then had to have a socialist. And if anybody could get 5% of the votes, even some Nazis, I had to have them on. And I could never speak up against the war or the fact that America was destroying Black culture and murdering Blacks, because I would have lost my job for violating the Fairness Doctrine. And when John Kennedy was alive, there were 1,500 different owners of media. The worst president in the history of this country, Bill Clinton, signed the Communications Act in 1996, put all of those into the hands of 5 major corporations. And anybody living in America today who is 30 years of age or younger has never known America with a free press, and we're never going to get a free press. I mean, Donald Trump, he kept screaming about, fake news, fake news. He could have fixed it with his pen, just sign it and reverse the Communications Act. No, he needed a fake press the same way the Nazis needed Jews, and the same way in the 50s we needed commies. He needed a mutual enemy that we had, because we all hated the press. And
speaking of the free press and everything, I wanted to bring in a couple of my other panelists, including the founder of this network, who is trying to bring free press here through the founding of Pod TV. He's been listening to a lot of our conversation, and also Jatovi, who is involved in the entertainment industry and is into esports and all along those lines, and has definitely been involved in a number of things as well. As you can see, he's got his young son with him also as that way, but he oftentimes joins in the show also. But definitely, I just wondered, definitely Nick and Jatovi, y'all have been listening. Mr. Barber is fascinating, as you heard. His son,
yeah, he's very entertaining. He should have his own show.
Nick,
hey, John, either what you're saying is true, or you're extremely crazy, and I haven't been able to figure out which yet. Well, but let me tell you one thing that we did our research on is what you said. 5 major companies own 90% of the media in the United States. That is absolutely true. And we found that when we started the network, which was started out of the frustration having to deal with your US media. Of course, now we broadcast in over 200 countries, a small group of followers, about 2.3 million people, but not bad for a couple of years.
First off, I must tell you, I'm thrilled not only to see you, but a guy, Jatovi, underneath you. I mean, like me, 2 nice-looking guys who don't have beards. I'm just so delighted to see that, and to see that behind you, you have books.
Oh, well, in real life, I'm actually a pension attorney. So I have a pension. I am a tax attorney who specializes in qualified plans, and for 12 years, a professor at Northeastern University, lead faculty for qualified plans.
Oh, that's wonderful, and I'm
so I have a different what I call real life, and a 3-time Florida state champion at chess and a USCF master. So I have another life. So I have all these other lives out there.
I love the fact that you say you don't know whether I'm truthful or I'm crazy.
Well, it doesn't matter. It's very entertaining. I'm listening to this stuff. I'm going, hey, when I was listening, I said, I got to see the documentaries. Honestly, I don't watch TV, so I've never seen real people. As I told Mark, I've never seen one episode of Friends. So when that person died, I didn't know who they were. I just don't watch television because I just don't get TV. I watch a lot of the Pod TV stuff because it's interesting.
Television is impossible to watch. Do you know, when I started Real People, and Mark could remember this, in order to get into television, first of all, you had to have a modicum of talent. You had to have a modicum of intelligence. You had to be sort of an individual. Sure. When I started Real People, which was the first reality show, I said to my wife, it's like opening a bottle of Lafite Rothschild wine. My God, it's so tasty and it's so wonderful. But if you leave the cork off of that wine and it stays there, it turns into vinegar.
Mm-hmm.
And reality television in America has just degenerated into that, because now, in order to become a success in reality television, now the only talent you need is a talent to not be embarrassed. I cannot watch American television.
Hey, Mr. Barber, along those same lines, just really quickly.
I want to see your documentary. I want to see those documentaries.
No, we definitely want to see those documentaries. But Mr. Barber, along those same lines, just really quickly. Hold on a second. Just really quickly, Mr. Barber, along those same lines, one of the greatest reality TV shows in my mind and everything, and I am actually a fan of your son's show, but a lot of those criminal shows in a lot of ways are the better version in my mind of reality TV, because they actually bring things to the forefront that are real trials. They're based on real trials oftentimes. So I'm thinking that things like Criminal Mind or NY, the one that's around the sexual violence, SVU, and a number of others that came out in like the 90s and everything are more realistic versions of reality TV.
Most of those are scripted. So I want to get back to talking to Nick.
I want to hear about this JFK stuff, because I got to deal with the government. I've been an attorney for 40 years now, so I have to interface with this government all the time.
Oh my God. Well, I
want to hear about these JFK stuff,
Okay, well, I'm going to tell you how, I'm so glad you're there.
I'm dying to watch those documentaries.
Seriously. Okay, the first one you should watch is the second one. It's only $2 on Amazon. It's called The American Media and the Second Assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And about 8 minutes into it, there is a section about 8 minutes long, which starts with pictures of O.J. Simpson fleeing the cops in his white Bronco. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Okay, so then I go on to explain that. And then John Benet Ramsey, remember all the time spent on that? Okay, so listen, I speak nothing but truth because I can't help it. And I'm going to tell you why, which I think you will find kind of amusing. But in this 8 minutes, I point out the $18 billion that the media spent on these crimes. And yet the most important crime in the history of America is the murder of John Kennedy. And you know how much money was spent on investigating that?
How much?
$800.
Oh,
Breitbart Magazine and Jim Garrison's investigation, $800. Okay. And oh my God, I get so angry when I think about this. But you know how much the U.S. government spent to suppress the investigation in the murder of John Kennedy? $18 billion. And it's all cataloged. You can't find one American meaningful newsman. I don't care if it's Peter Jennings or Cronkite or any of them, not one of them speaking up and questioning the lies that were so obvious. Now, I'm going to tell you why I'm such an inadvertent truth teller. Intellectually, I'm 5,000 years old. Chronologically, I'm 90. Emotionally, I am 8. And if I have a talent, it's the talent of seeing the obvious and verbalizing it. And I've had it ever since I was 8 years old. And I'll give you a perfect example of that. You've heard that I've had this horrible, god-awful family. Okay, so the only person I knew is a young man named Don Lee, who had a wonderful mother and father. They lived a block away from me. And I went over to their house one day and I knocked on the door and I asked if they would adopt me. And they said, well, no, we can't adopt you. You've got a mother. I said, no, I haven't. Come on over to my house. I'll show it's empty. She's in Buffalo with one of my uncles, an uncle I'd never even met. And she said, oh, John, we can't do that. But how would you like to come to church with us? Well, I'd never been to church, but I wanted to be around people. So she gave me the Bible. And she said, you go home and you read this, and you come here next week, and we're going to take you across the street to this Baptist church, which is why they moved there. So I go home and I spend every day, every minute reading and memorizing the Bible, and I can't wait. So we go into church, and the minister has a great thing that he does. He's after there is a universal prayer, he said, now you're going to have a private prayer with God. So I'm taking out a minute for you to pray to your God. So what am I going to pray for? That my father comes home. That's what I'm praying for. So Mrs. Lee asked me if I want to come to lunch afterwards. No, I'm going to run home and find my father at home. So I rush home, open the door. Dad, it's an echo. There is no father. And I do this for 13 weeks. And after 13 weeks, I say, it's not working. And so a 13th week, when he says you can have your private prayer now, I get up. This is a 12-year-old, and there's a commotion because people are praying, and I walk out, and the minister spots me. I go sit on the concrete steps and wait. Minister comes out, and he puts his hand on my shoulder right away, and I start to cry. It's the first time I ever cried in my life because nobody had ever touched me. And then he said, son, now I'm starting to cry even more. He said, are you okay? And I said, no, sir, I am not okay. And he said, why? I said, I've been praying for 12 weeks now that my father come home, and none of the prayers are being answered. So this is not for me. So he said to me, you must understand God's will. And I looked at him, and I don't know where it came from. And I said, I don't think I'm in it. Well, everybody started to laugh. And he didn't like the fact that I was getting a laugh as a 12-year-old. And then he says to me, don't let the devil overtake your life. Don't become part of Satan's life. And so I say to him, obviously, you really believe in Satan? Now, if these people had not been there, that man would have punched me. You could see hate in his eyes. Where was the Christian love? And he said, absolutely. I said, well, isn't that proof there's no God? Now, the other people aren't too fond of me either, okay? He said, how dare you say that? I said, well, if God is all powerful, why doesn't he get rid of them? And I have been like that all of my life. I never lie. You know why? Mark Twain said, if you tell the truth, you don't have to have a good memory. The other thing that Mark Twain said that changed my life, the two greatest days in your life are the day you're born and the day you find out why. And the day I found out why I was born was when I watched Jack Paar. Now, certainly you must have watched Jack Paar when you were younger. By far the greatest, the smartest talk show in history. I didn't know that people had conversations. I thought they threw beer cans at one another, punched or cursed one another. And he opened every show with a monologue. And that's when I decided, well, I'm going to get a show like that, and I'm going to write jokes. And I did. I didn't even know I could write. I'm 25. Okay. I was out of school when I was 15. Never had a lesson about anything. And all of a sudden, I write 5 minutes of great material. And a week later, I'm co-starring with Jim Nabors in a club in Santa Monica. So, and from there it was history. I was enormously successful as a comic, as a producer, as a writer, and everything I did, except I was totally clamped down and shut down when I tried to tell Jim Garrison's story, on which I have spent 53 years and over $500,000 and still going strong.
Mr. Barber, Yeah, Mr. Barber, I know that you've had some great stories and definitely want to hear from Jacoby as well. He might have a question for you, but you've had the pleasure of working with some amazing people. I know that Lenny Bruce was one of them. You definitely mentioned Jim Neighbor and being a North Carolinian. I know about Gomer Powell and all in that kind of space, but you also worked with Tim Conway and a number of others. So I just wondering what your thoughts are, and if maybe Jacoby has some thoughts and questions for you as well around the nature of Hollywood in the 21st century.
Hollywood's done with. Hollywood was at its peak making movies in 1939. And I was fortunate enough to live through the golden years where, like your founder of this network once saw, Jack Farr, you cannot find people like that anymore. So I am torn between the two of you guys. I mean, I can tell you the greatest Hollywood stories that you have ever heard. Or I can tell you the most interesting stories of Jim Garrison in the United States. So I don't know quite where to begin because there is so much to talk about. So we could toss coins and you could have turns. Okay. One asks a question and then somebody else asks a question about show business. Somebody asks a question about Mr. Garrison. So I'm in a quandary right now.
Mark, we're going to have to bring him back because we have our show that originates from Kyiv, Ukraine coming.
Wow. How
we actually do a show twice a week from Ukraine.
Oh my God.
Russia, China, Ukraine. We have several shows that are produced not in the United States. Mark is going to get that show started, but it goes over what's happening in the war in Ukraine from Kyiv, Ukraine.
Oh my God, how interesting!
Well, we have shows also that originate from Bangladesh and Malaysia. They're all in English so far, but because of translator programs, we can actually translate instantaneously. Well, it takes about an hour. You can translate these into other languages, so people can listen to languages.
I'm going to close by saying this. First of all, I would absolutely love to come back and talk to you guys again because it's so diverse. I mean, your partner is interested in show business and you're interested in politics in the world. And of course, the world is coming apart at the seams. Personally, I don't think the United States should have anything to do with Russia. It's none of our business. It's, the Soviet Union is surrounded by scores and scores of American bases with atom bombs on them, okay? And the United States is a distinct threat to the Soviet Union, and they have been ever since 1917, when Russia was invaded for 5 years by the United States, England, France, and Germany to try to restore the Romanovs. And as Mr. Garrison says, in the second documentary, which you should watch, Russia was no threat. They lost 25 million people and 80% of their infrastructure. So, but I will leave you with this. It's one of the most touching things I ever read. During the Civil War, a 17-year-old soldier is wounded fatally, and he knows he's going to die. And he calls a preacher over to get last rites or whatever they get in those days. And he says to the preacher, he says, "Sir, all my life, everything I prayed to God for, I never got. But he gave me everything I needed." Well, you want to know something? I am that 17-year-old boy. It's just astonishing how blessed my life has been. It's the amazing Canadian rags to American riches story that nobody else could have lived but me. And aside from that, if you send me your address, I will send you an autographed copy of the very best book ever written by anyone in this business. It's called Your Mother's Not a Virgin, which is true, and The Bumpy Life and Times of the Canadian Dropout Who Changed the Face of American Television. And in it, you don't have to read from beginning to end, because one of the things that Mark didn't mention, I was the original host of The Gong Show. So you can
Wow.
Yeah, so you can find out all these stories just by going to that page and reading 5. And I spent Lenny Bruce's last week with Lenny Bruce. And if we weren't going now to Kiev or wherever you're going, I could tell you about Lenny Bruce's sad last great week that he spent only with me and my wife. So I guess it's goodbye.
Well, yeah, we'll have to bring you on again, and we do have some shows that originate from Canada also as well. And just to let you know, and then we also have David Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States. He does a show once a week also on the network,
Well,
talking about this national.
Wherever it originates, I don't care. I would just
Okay.
because it's
All right,
so
just beam in from wherever you're at. And with that, we want to thank our viewers around the world, and we'll see you tomorrow on the World Edition. Take care. Bye-bye.
take